Well, welcome once again to Calaveras Living. You know, probably on most adults' minds in this country, and maybe some teenagers and college students too, we all think about health care. What's health care like in this country? But how much do we think about what is health care like in other countries? So how well off are we? So we asked Dr. Randy Smart to come and join us today. He spent some time in Africa, and we're going to talk about what he observed there regarding health care. Dr. Smart, it's good to see you.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here and great to be in Calaveras.
Well, and not in Africa. How did you happen to be in Africa, or what years were those two?
Well, I had a medical scholarship to the medical school in Bethesda, which was affiliated with the military. And so I became a military doctor. And I was very interested in internal medicine and infection and diseases. And my thought was to spend my time in the big academic centers. And I had a mentor named George, Dr. George Crawford, who he and I talked about this, and he said, Randy, what you need to do is go out there and get out there and see the unusual stuff, do the unusual stuff, and then come back and teach us all about it.
Mm. And you said to him, why don't you go, George?
And I was a little bit taken aback, right? I thought it was rejection, actually. And it was probably some of the best advice I think I've ever had. Oh. And so I ended up at an Air Force base in Germany that was regarded as a tactical base.
What year was that?
And this would have been in 1990.
Okay. Oh, fairly recently, yeah.
And so what a tactical base hospital does is they go out and do operational medicine. They take operational hospitals anywhere in the world, they set up and they see patients. And part of our mission was to go in and out of Africa to do clinical care. And I got involved in that in 1990, and I was interested in it. And over a period of about 5 years, I became the chief operational officer for that project, and probably completed 13, 14 missions in and out of Africa.
Oh, wow. In various countries in Africa, huh?
Right. We didn't go to the tourist countries. We went to the tougher places. My first mission was in a place most people haven't heard of called Guinea-Bissau, which is an old Portuguese colony. I've been to Sierra Leone, where the current Ebola epidemic is, sure. In Freetown, where the current Ebola epidemic is. We went to Namibia, down in South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Niger. And what we did is we sort of set up a portable clinic where we could see patients and help manage their problems. Mm-hmm.
How long would you stay there at a time?
We would usually stay 3 to 4 weeks.
Oh, okay, so quite a while.
Yes, sir. And we would be pretty self-sufficient. We would bring our own tents, our own medical gear. The only thing we really needed was some translators and a little bit of transportation. Mm-hmm. So we would provide general medical care, which is what I and the other doctors did. We would provide some surgical services and quite a bit of dental, and then some obstetrics for the pregnant women. And so we would stay 3 to 4 weeks, which was an absolutely fascinating experience. And then we would pack up and go back to Germany.
Hmm. Now, were you kind of shocked at the start? Or were you saw what you thought you would see?
The first mission I participated in, we landed on a dirt runway, and there were 3 guys with machine guns staring at us. And I said, who are those guys? And they said, well, we think they're the security, but we're not sure.
It was the IRS. No, I'm sorry.
and I think it was the security, but I'm still not sure.
Yeah, or security for whom?
But these countries are so far from the world we live in so many ways, literally and figuratively. Yeah. They're so far from where we are. And they have a different healthcare infrastructure. they are, you don't get used to it. As long as you're there, you're sort of in awe of what you see and what you're surrounded by.
So what were some of your challenges? I mean, what did you see as far as the condition of the people and how they were taken care of, if they were taken care of?
Right, so the clinics were organized sort of, they were advertised in advance that the Americans would be there and they would be treating diseases. And some of the patients were prearranged to see us by their healthcare nurses. They don't have a lot of doctors. They have nurses that do healthcare. And so some of them, they would say, look, we want you to see this person because we don't know what's wrong. But many of them were people who would just line up and say, you know, I have headaches all the time, or I have lost weight, or I can't breathe, or and you would just take one at a time, and you would try to do what you can without doing any harm. And so you could really see anything. I don't want to be too graphic, but it could be a mother holding a baby that had been deceased, and she would bring it in and say, "Can you help us?" You know. And
she didn't know the baby was dead?
She wasn't sure.
She wasn't sure.
Wasn't sure. It could be that. It could be gunshot wounds. It could be knife wounds. It could be malaria. It could be HIV, AIDS disease. Just a whole host of things we normally don't see. Mm-hmm. In this country, we see flu, and we see blood pressure, and we see diabetes. A lot of the chronic conditions, and in those countries, they certainly have those diseases, but they have much more serious problems before you even get to those diseases. Mm-hmm. They could have gangrene, and the gangrene becomes more important than the blood pressure or the heart disease, right? So we would see pretty much whatever walked in, sometimes with translators, and sometimes you just found ways to communicate, even if you didn't speak the same language. And tried not to do any harm, tried to help people, tried to administer medicines, and learned a lot while we did that. And I think we helped a lot of people.
Did you have a chance when you'd come the next time? Well, you, of course, you went to different countries, so you didn't really see a follow-up on a lot of those people you saw maybe one time and not again? Exactly,
and so when we would first contact some of the healthcare providers in those countries, one of the things they were so concerned about is not starting something and leaving it for them. So, for example, not doing a surgery and then saying, okay, we won't be back, good luck. And we tried very hard not to do that, but we would immunize, a lot of immunizations. We would treat a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, and we would do things that we thought we would have sort of immediate benefit without obligating anybody else to do anything in the future.
Now, when you said they had a number of nurses but very few doctors, were the doctors well educated, the few they had, or the nurses?
Well, the healthcare infrastructure in Africa is just vastly different than what we have in the States or Europe or Russia. And basically what you have is you have multiple people providing health care from multiple organizations. And so you have NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations, and an example of that would be the World Health Organization, UNICEF, Doctors Without Frontiers, and those organizations would almost always have a presence somewhere. So in one little town you could have a WHO project, in another town you could have a UNICEF project, you could have missionary projects, and so that's where most, not all, but most of the physician level care came from, is from the NGOs. The country itself would usually have a healthcare ministry, and the healthcare ministry would have clinics scattered around the country, almost always run by nurses and not by physicians. And the nurses were very well trained. They did a lot of hard work. But they weren't physicians. They just didn't.
Sure.
They just didn't have.
Well, no surgery then, or very little surgery.
Well, the surgeries were done by the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. And for example, I was in one village, I believe up in the northern end of Guinea-Bissau, and there was a kind of a clinic hospital kind of thing, and there was an Italian surgeon in there, and he operated all day long every day. And people came from hundreds of miles for a variety of problems, C-sections, to deliver a baby, gallbladder surgeries, gangrene, trauma. And I'll never forget this. Right outside the operating room was a clothesline with gloves, with plastic gloves hanging on it.
Oh.
And I said, "What are those?" And they said, "Well, those are the surgeon's gloves."
But they didn't have
said,
a way to sterilize
are they sterile?
them?
And they said, well, just before the case, we sterilize him real quick, and then he operates. And I said, do you have infections? And they said, no, we do, okay. But the problem is he has to give both the anesthesia and do the operation. Yeah. He's the only guy there. And it was so impressive. And I met him and talked to him and had lunch with him. And I said, why do you do this? And he said, I'm helping humanity and I'm helping this country, and that's what I want to do.
How old a man was he?
40s.
Oh, young man, yeah.
40s. And there were so many examples of that. If I could digress a little bit, I think one of the most impressive kind of healthcare operations I saw in Africa was a leprosarium, a leprosy hospital. I was in, I believe it was Ghana, and they said, look, would you like to see the leprosy hospital? And I said, absolutely, let's go. And so we went on these old rickety dirt roads for miles and miles, and I actually thought we were lost. And we finally arrived at these buildings, and these buildings were sort of the hospital. There were 4 or 5 of them, and I met these 2 surgeons. They were both Franciscan monks, and they both had just exquisite training. Some of the best training in the world. Most of it came out of France, some of it came out of Italy. Mm-hmm. And they were there, and to treat leprosy requires a lot of surgical reconstruction. So you will do a tendon transposition. Because a thumb won't work, you'll take a tendon from another finger and sew it and graft it to the thumb so the patient will have a thumb and can function in life. Yeah. And they were doing this kind of work in the middle of nowhere. And I looked at the patients, I rounded on the patients with them, I talked to them, I asked them about, what antibiotics, what medicines are you using, because I knew a little bit about leprosy. And it was state of the art. It was absolutely state of the art. Wow. In the middle of nowhere. And so I said again, I said, what are you guys doing here? And they say, this is what the church asks us to do, and this is what we've dedicated our lives to do, and we'll stay here forever. How
were they financially supported? By what organization? For the church itself supplied the money?
I think through the Catholic Church. Right? I think that is exactly right. And that didn't go into salaries. That went into medical supplies and suture and in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, that's amazing. You mentioned, too, we were talking earlier, that polio is somewhat widespread in certain areas over there?
Right. So it reminds me of 2 stories, actually. So a lot of Africans don't get immunized. They don't have the opportunity or the resources. And so the diseases we prevent in this country, like polio and tetanus and measles, are not always prevented there. And so I was in, I believe it was in Zimbabwe, and in the outskirts of town there was this entire row of adult tricycles. They were big tricycles.
Oh, like actual tricycles, not bicycles, not three-wheeler.
A three-wheeler.
Three-wheelers.
And the pedals were up by the handlebars. Uh-huh. And so I looked at these things, and there was probably 100 of them lined up. And I kind of looked at them, and I'm trying to kind of figure out what I'm looking at. And this patient comes out of a store on a wheelboard. He wheels himself out, jumps up on the tricycle. His legs are clearly not working, pulls his wheelboard up on the tricycle, and pedals off down the street with his arms.
So all those lined up were people in similar situations, huh?
And I said to the people I was with, I said, so are all these people paralyzed? And they said, yes, they all had polio.
Wow.
And it's just something we don't think about anymore.
Oh, yeah.
And we're all protected against. But it was a beautiful system. I mean, it's tragic to be paralyzed.
Sure.
But it was absolutely a beautiful system. They had rollerboards and tricycles, and they were buying groceries and, you know, getting through life without any complaints.
What resilience. Wow.
Oh, it's so humbling. It is. And the other story I'm reminded of was the ventilator ward. And I believe this was in Niger, and the capital of Niger is Niamey. And in Niamey, we visited the hospital, and one of the wards had all these ventilators for breathing. Mm-hmm. And there must have been 100 or 150 patients on these ventilators, and it was pretty striking. And I said, "Is this the pneumonia ward?" And they kind of laughed, and they said, "No, this is the tetanus ward."
And is that the usual treatment for tetanus, or? So
tetanus causes respiratory paralysis,
okay.
and often those patients die because they can't breathe. Now, people in this country don't get tetanus. I mean, there are scattered cases, but this is an entire ward of people on ventilators and penicillin. And I said, so how do they do? They said, oh, they'll all be fine. Once we get the penicillin in them, and once the fever goes down, we'll get them off the ventilators, they'll go home and they'll be fine. And that was just another day in Africa. So,
wow.
So very impressive. I mean, and
what a revelation.
It impresses upon you how helpful our immunization and prevention programs are in this country, and how we don't always think of that. We get the shots and we say, well, the doctor told me to get the shot. It must be worth my while. But we don't see polio. We don't see tetanus. We see some measles, not a lot. But these diseases were all over the African countries.
Yeah. What other ones are pretty prevalent? You mentioned HIV, but what other ones are prevalent throughout Africa?
A lot of malaria. That they pretty much live with. I was giving a lecture in one of the lecture halls, which I could digress about also, but the translator was having some trouble. He was a big man, he was a nurse, and he was having some trouble. He just seemed sweaty and he seemed uncomfortable, and I kind of pulled him aside. I said, are you okay? He says, well, my malaria is acting up today. And I said, shouldn't you go home and, this isn't that important? Yeah. And he says, oh no, we all have it and we do fine. We're okay. He says, I'll take tomorrow off.
They just kind of live with it, huh?
They do. Not everybody can live with it. Some of the infants and younger patients, it can be devastating. It can be life-threatening.
Or I guess elderly too.
And the elderly, exactly. It can be a totally life-threatening disease, but again, there's not a lot of malaria in this country, and so for me, Africa was just this very rich experience of seeing diseases, of understanding how much we really have in this country, and how much can be done in other countries. And the memories from 1990 through 95 are just so vivid.
That must have been, I mean, at a young age, you were there getting all this experience. Did you come back and see George?
I did come back and see George. George is still a good friend to this day. And I said, I want to really thank you for kind of pushing me out of the nest. What I really was in George's office to talk about is I wanted to be on his faculty at a teaching center. Mm-hmm. And I was the chief resident, and George said, you're the best doctor I have. I want you to be here. I would love to have you here. but you're not going to be here, and this is why, and this is what you're going to do. So years later, I did come back and thank George, and I've seen him at meetings. He's out on he's actually down in Texas now. But it was a wonderful thing to do for somebody who didn't understand the value of it.
Yeah. As far as you know now, have things improved in Africa in the last, say, decade or something as far as health care, or just more people diseased and ill?
You know, I've actually not been back. I try to follow some of that. And in some countries there are improvements, and I think for the most part it hasn't changed a lot. There's a lot of disease, a lot of HIV, a lot of malaria, a lot of morbidity, and a lot of mortality. I don't know that it's really changed a lot. I actually wasn't at all surprised to hear of the Ebola epidemic.
Yeah, I guess that didn't surprise you with what you know.
No, it really didn't, because people in Africa are pretty crowded together, population centers.
Yeah.
And you can have many, many people in a very small space. Sanitation is different. Hygiene is different.
Yeah, very, very limited pure water, right?
Very limited.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of tribal customs. And we ran into that early on, where we were trying to prevent diseases with behavioral changes. We were saying, look, if you only do this, you won't get that disease. And they said, no, according to our tribal custom,
that's what they do.
We do that. And so that enters into it. But when you put all those elements together, a place like Freetown, Sierra Leone, is exactly where you would expect to see an Ebola outbreak. I mean, all the elements are there. People are there, tend to be malnourished, maybe not the healthiest, close living quarters, not good sanitation, limited health care, and boom.
Yeah, they talk in this country about your immune system. If you had a strong immune system, well, probably people over there don't have very strong immune systems. Huh?
They probably don't. One of the things we encountered a lot was malnutrition. And nutrition is so linked to your immune system. And people were skinny, malnourished, and susceptible. And so a disease that may not be as devastating to you or I could be fatal for them.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly right. I mean, those were elements that have probably fueled the Ebola epidemic.
Yeah, that's sad. Now, how many years have you been here, Doctor?
Well, I retired from the Air Force in 2002 after 24 years, and I came up here kind of intending to retire, and that didn't work out very well.
You're too young to retire.
Well, evidently.
Yeah, well, that's just my opinion. You don't have to go by.
So I became involved in the healthcare at Mark Twain and in the rural health clinics, and ultimately my own private practice, which is now in Murphy's. And I'm still busy every day, all day.
Well, I hear, in fact, someone I knew, I think you're not taking any new patients right now because you have so many, right?
It's hard to find room for new patients.
Yeah.
It's hard to. I try to, but my practice style is that I don't want to be doing 10-minute appointments where people don't get good care. If somebody needs care, I want to be able to spend 30 minutes with them. I want to talk to them. I want to look at what medicines they're on, and I want to make sure everybody understands what the plan is and where we're going. And it takes a little more time, so you don't have room for as many patients. But the outcomes are so much better.
Oh, well, being, just a consumer myself and having some problems that I have, to be rushed in and rushed out, and is just psychologically gets me.
It's not very personal.
No, it isn't. And we had a doctor, I won't say his name, but he said, well, I have to go. He says, I have other patients waiting. And he made us wait for 20 minutes, and then he only gave us 15.
Right.
And I said, well, you know, we haven't asked these questions before, my wife and I. I said, you may have heard them 100 times, you think you have pat answers, but we're still interested in you listening to us, but he didn't listen.
My impression, I started medicine when it was a profession that was run by doctors. And the patients were unique and special and treated that way. And I really think, John, there is a trend toward almost the industrialization of medicine, where people are kind of rushed through a system. Maybe the doctor doesn't even know their name really.
Oh, sometimes.
Or doesn't spend enough time. The doctor is, because of that pace, the doctor, I think, is going to be challenged to think clearly and give everybody the same level of care. But it's not personal, and it's not necessarily, in my mind, it's not good care.
No, and some doctors seem to have preconceived ideas. Oh, I've run across that before. This is what you do. I said, please listen, I have some more to tell you. You know,
Right.
It's very difficult.
You know, people like George would tell. I had the just the very good fortune of being trained by, I think, some really, really smart people that I really respected. And man, one of the things they would always say is, you have to listen to the patient. If you just be quiet and you listen to the patient, they will tell you what's wrong.
Yeah.
Now, we synthesize all that. I mean, they don't say, well, look, I have falciparum malaria. They don't say that.
No.
But if you listen to what they say, you can say, you know, he's got malaria. I can tell you he's got malaria. But you have to listen first.
Sure. And how the person actually feels. I don't know.
And there doesn't seem to be a lot of time for that anymore. So I think that's a trend I really don't like, and I try to keep out of my practice. It's not a very... it's not very economically smart to practice the way I do, but it's very rewarding, and I sleep great at night.
Well, that's good. You deserve it. And it's good to see you again. And last time we talked about the robots out there, and coming up maybe in the next couple of months we'll talk about some other things you're working on, right?
I'd love to do that. I've got 2 projects I'm very excited about, and I think Calaveras would be excited about, and I would love to bring them to the show and tell you about them.
Well, it's always good to see you, and I always learn something.
Great to see you.
And I don't pay you.
You don't have to.
Okay.
You pay me with friendship.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, that's it. 30 minutes just zips by. We'll see you next time on Calaveras Living. Thanks a lot.